Jesus is the Passover. He's also first fruits. That's why he was resurrected. So we will be celebrating the Jewish feast. Why don't we do that today? You wouldn't understand it, so we call it Easter. But what we're really celebrating is Jesus is our Passover lamb. Now, according to Leviticus chapter 23, verse number 2, the feasts of the Lord are rehearsals. So when the Jews kept the feast, they were actually rehearsing what the Messiah would do when he came. The spring feast has to do with the first coming of the Messiah, and the fall feast has to do with the second coming of the Messiah. In Jesus' first coming, he was the Passover lamb. So you actually partook of the Passover meal during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Why? Because leaven represents sin. And what the Passover lamb does is he takes away the sin. Remember when John the Baptist saw Jesus, what did he say? Behold the Lamb that taketh away the sins of the world. So when you were taking or participating in the Feast of the Passover lamb and you were eating of that lamb, you also ate with unleavened bread. Why? Because the Passover lamb takes away the sins of the world. And how long did you eat unleavened bread? 7 days. Why? 7 is a number of significance. It means perfect and complete. So Jesus comes, he's our Passover lamb. He also takes away the leaven. We eat that for 7 days. On Sunday, first fruits, Jesus was resurrected. So on the 10th of Nisan, every household was supposed to select a Passover lamb. And every day, for 4 days, you were supposed to inspect it to ensure that your Passover lamb had no flaws, to ensure that it was perfect. Now, when Jesus entered into Jerusalem on a donkey, all of the people began singing, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest," which is a messianic psalm. It's Psalm 118:26. You see, every Jew at the time of Jesus knew that these feasts were rehearsals, and they expected the Messiah to come to fulfill the feast. So on the 10th, everyone would pick their Passover lamb, and the high priest, he would pick his. His lamb represented the lamb for the entire nation. His was referred to, as we'll find out, the final Passover lamb. So when he brought his lamb in, the people would begin to shout, "Yes! Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest." But what they were doing was rehearsing for when the Messiah would really come. Well, on the 10th of Nisan, Jesus does this triumphal entry, which is the very same day the high priest is bringing in the Passover lamb. And everyone begins to shout. And many of the people recognize and realize this is the Messiah. So they start saying this messianic psalm. But it goes a little bit further. The people begin shouting Hosanna to the Son of David, which is a messianic title. So again, the Jews knew that the feast were rehearsals, and they were expecting the Messiah to come to fulfill the feast. So this wasn't just a triumphant entry. This was Jesus entering as the Messiah and as the final Passover lamb. And 4 days, he was on the Temple Mount being examined by the people, the priests, and the religious leaders. Just as the Passover lambs were being examined every day for 4 days. So what you would do is, you got your Passover lamb on the 10th, you inspected it. You inspected it on the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th. On the 14th day, you're going to slay it. Jesus arrives on the 10th. He's examined by the religious leaders, the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, and the 13th. What day is he going to be crucified? He's going to be crucified on the same day that the Passover lambs are going to be slain. So that's what takes place. And at the end of Jesus' trial, this is what's interesting. How many of you remember when they arrested him and brought him before Pilate? At the end of his trial, before he was led away to be crucified, what did Pilate say? Pilate said, "I find no fault in him." Those are the very words that the Jews were supposed to say after examining their lamb for 4 days and right before they sacrificed it. Every person who had their Passover lamb, when they brought it up, they had been inspecting it for 4 days. This is now the day to sacrifice it. They would bring it before the priest and they would say, "I find no fault in it." And that's when they would slay it. Well, that's exactly what Pilate said about Jesus. Not once, but twice. "I find no fault in him." Now, the last lamb to be sacrificed every year for Passover was always the high priest's lamb. That's why it was called the final Passover lamb. And it was sacrificed at the 9th hour, which is 3 p.m. And the reason that it had to be done by 3 p.m. was because he had another ritual to perform before the sun went down. So at the 9th hour, the high priest sacrificed his lamb, and as soon as he sacrificed his lamb and he caught the blood in the bowl, after he caught all the blood, he would take a step back, he would spread his arms, and he would shout, "It is finished!" And at the very time that the high priest spreads his arms and shouts that, Jesus is on the cross. He takes one more gasp of air and he shouts out, "It is finished!" And he died. Now listen to me. Jesus still had to descend into hell to pay for our sins. So why in the world did he scream, "It is finished"? Well, I'll tell you why. Because as God's high priest, he was letting us know that the final Passover lamb had been slain. And we would never, ever have to sacrifice a Passover lamb again. He was the final Passover lamb. And as the Passover lambs were going into the ovens, Jesus' body was going into the grave. And as the lambs were being cooked by fire, Jesus' soul was in hell. So after the final Passover lamb had been slain, the high priest and his entourage, they would cross the Kidron Valley and they would walk up the Mount of Olives to the small barley field that the Levites had planted just for this event. And then what they would do is they would go into this barley field and they would reach out, the high priest would, and he would grab as much of the stalks of the barley that he could, and he would bring them together. And then the high priest would take the cord and he would wrap it around and he would tie it. All right? But he didn't cut them. He did 10 sheaves like that, but they were still attached to the ground. So about 5 or 5:30 in the morning, before the sun came up, the high priest and his entourage would climb back up on the Mount of Olives, and then they would walk up to each one of the sheaves that had been marked, and the high priest would take a sickle and he would cut the bottom of the stalks, freeing them from the roots that tied them to the earth. In fact, that's how they described it. That's very significant. These stalks that were tied to the earth, he literally would cut them, freeing them from being tied to the earth. And then he would place each one of the sheaves into a basket to take back to the temple to present to God. And at the same time, the high priest was harvesting the first fruits. At the very same time that he was cutting those stalks, Jesus was resurrected. But not just Jesus. When Jesus died and the earthquake happened, some of the tombs broke open. In other words, the tombstones covering the graves rolled away. They revealed these tombs were open. But the people in those tombs didn't come to life until after Jesus was resurrected. Look at verse 53 again. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the Holy City and appeared to many people. So they didn't come back to life until after Jesus was resurrected. But their tombs were open 3 days earlier. Why? Why were the tombs open 3 days earlier? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because the first fruits were always marked on the day of Passover after the final lamb was slain. But they weren't harvested until the Feast of First Fruits 3 days later. So the whole purpose of the earthquake when Jesus died was to mark which of the saints would be resurrected at the first fruits. Yeah. Now, after the first fruits was harvested, the high priest would take them back to the temple to prepare them for an offering for the Lord. So there was a period of time between the harvesting of the first fruits and the offering to the Lord. Yeah, about an hour and a half. And that's why when Mary saw Jesus in the garden, he told her not to touch him because he hadn't yet ascended to the Father. In fact, he would not ascend until it was the designated time for the priest to offer the first fruits to the Lord in the holy place. You see, at the very time the high priest had everything ready and began offering the first fruits to the Lord was the very time that Jesus was in the temple in heaven offering his first fruits to the Lord. Yeah. But there was a period of time between the time you cut the stalks and to when you actually offered them. So there was this small window of time, about an hour and a half from when Jesus was resurrected to when he ascended to heaven with the first fruits of his harvest to offer them to God. That's why many of the saints who were resurrected had time to go into Jerusalem to appear unto their family and friends. But shortly after that, about an hour and a half later, they ascended with Jesus to the throne of God, where Jesus presented them to God as the first fruits offering. He also took all of the souls that were in the bosom of Abraham to heaven, and they were part of the first fruits offering. So now when a believer dies, his soul goes to heaven, but his body is buried, and it begins to decay. But at the final harvest, because that was just first fruits, at the final harvest, the bodies of all the saints will be resurrected.